It was a Tuesday morning that promised nothing more thrilling than damp hedgerows and the occasional puff of smoke from the station chimney. In Flaxborough, such mornings were regarded as entirely satisfactory. Life had a way of unfolding politely, with accidents confined to the occasional overturned wheelbarrow and the minor indignities of local bureaucracy. Yet, at 10:15 precisely, the town's serene calendar of minor domestic inconveniences was interrupted. The venue was the town hall, which had the dual function of hosting the flower and vegetable show and allowing the council clerk to pretend he was indispensable. Mrs. Gertrude Hemingway, recently widowed, presided over the tea table with a precision that suggested both habit and rehearsal. She poured with the gentle grace of a woman accustomed to invisible observers, filling cups in a silent choreography. Those present noted only the usual slight tremors in her hand, the occasional bend of her spine, until her husband, deceased for 3 days, was escorted into the hall in a manner that drew polite but audible murmurs. It was not, of course, unusual for a widow to grieve publicly, or even theatrically, but the precise act of pouring a cup of tea for her husband's corpse was something that had no precedent in living memory. The body, carefully arranged in his armchair with a handkerchief tucked under his chin, seemed to the more impressionable of the audience, as if merely waiting for a neighbourly chat. The contrast between the widow's industrious hospitality and the inert, slightly pallid form of Mr. Hemingway struck some as, at the very least, curious. I didn't expect him to join us," stammered Mrs. Frobisher, who had already sampled 2 scones and was eyeing a third with the air of someone committed to moral endurance. "Quite," replied Mr. Tully, the vicar, who had arrived in a fog of respectable late-morning propriety. Though in a town like Flaxborough, one supposes nothing is truly surprising. Gertrude, serene, placed the cup on a small table beside the armchair. The steam wafted upward, mingling faintly with the scent of roses, and for a moment the juxtaposition of domestic normality and morbid spectacle rendered the assembled townsfolk speechless. One or two of them adjusted their spectacles as though vision might somehow recalibrate reality. Inspector Purbright, called reluctantly from his tidy office on the High Street, arrived 20 minutes later. He was greeted with polite urgency, a tone that suggested both civic duty and mild embarrassment on the part of the council. "Inspector," said the chairman, clearing his throat as though apologizing to an unseen deity, "you will appreciate that Mrs. Hemingway has unusual habits." Purbright inclined his head. "I can see that," he said, his voice smooth, measured, as if tasting words before committing them to air. "It is not often one is called to tea with the recently deceased." The widow, upon hearing his voice, smiled faintly and offered another cup. "Would you like one, Inspector?" He always preferred Assam, though. She hesitated, glanced at the inert figure in the chair, then continued as though consulting a polite authority. "I made it exactly as he liked it." Purbright bowed slightly, accepting the cup with measured ceremony. He took a small sip. It was indeed Assam, correct strength, proper temperature, and a trace of sugar. "Exquisite," he said. "You have not lost your touch, Mrs. Hemingway." The widow's smile tightened imperceptibly. "Thank you. It is a comfort to maintain certain routines." Around the hall, the audience exchanged glances. Here was grief dressed as propriety, habit masquerading as normality, and somewhere between them the faint hum of something decidedly peculiar. As Purbright examined the scene, his gaze drifted over minor but telling details: the tilt of the corpse's head, the faint indentation of a chair cushion beneath a suit that had lost its wearer's warmth, the very deliberate positioning of the teapot spout toward the deceased's hand. All of it screamed civility, All of it whispered that someone had been quietly watching and waiting for something to happen. Mrs. Hemingway, noticing his attention, offered a faint explanation. "He always liked things proper, even now. I suppose some manners persist." "Indeed," Purbright murmured. Then, almost imperceptibly, he noted the peculiar absence of the morning paper, which was ordinarily draped over the deceased's lap like a vestige of living habit. "Would anyone care for more scones?" she asked, as if the previous events had been merely introductory entertainment. A few hands went up. The vicar, hesitant but dutiful, declined. "I'm rather taken, I confess," he said. Purbright, meanwhile, made a mental note of the absence of newsprint, the careful positioning of cups, and the faintest trace of lavender oil on the widow's sleeve, an aroma inconsistent with her usual habits. These, he knew, were details that the town would never remark upon, yet they whispered to him in the quiet language of small-town irregularities. By the time he had finished his cup, the initial shock had settled into a mild fascination, tempered by the ever-present impulse to gossip. Already Mrs. Frobisher was murmuring to her neighbour about the impropriety of attending to the dead in such a domestic manner. Mr. Tully was quietly calculating whether this was morally permissible, and the chairman was nervously glancing at the clock, as if hoping that an unnatural incident might conclude in an equally natural time frame. Purbright, for his part, remained unobtrusively attentive. He made notes, not on paper, but in the quiet ledger of observation he carried in his mind. Small details, slight gestures, and the manner in which people observed social rules or bent them told him more than raised voices or sensational headlines ever could. And so Flaxborough's Tuesday settled into an uneasy rhythm. Tea was poured, scones were eaten. A widow smiled politely at the corpse of her husband. And somewhere beneath the veneer of polite civility, the gears of curiosity, suspicion, and minor scandal began to turn. Purbright, sipping the final trace of Assam, allowed himself the smallest of smiles. The town might appear unremarkable, its events trivial, its people conventional, but he already sensed the ripple beneath the surface, and as always, in such matters, the ripple would tell the tale before anyone else had even realized there was a story to tell. By mid-afternoon, the town of Flaxborough had been thoroughly briefed, at least according to the fluid and highly selective channels of small-town communication. Mrs. Frobisher, whose enthusiasm for minor scandal was rivalled only by her penchant for sugar-laden scones, had already conveyed to half a dozen acquaintances that Mrs. Hemingway's comportment was most extraordinary, and one fears it verges on the uncanny. The phrasing carried the usual suggestion that moral decay was at hand, though specifics remained delightfully vague. In the market square, a cluster of shopkeepers discussed the incident with polite gravity. "One never knows what people are capable of until something like this happens," said the grocer, frowning over the afternoon ledger, as if the tea-table tableau had somehow infringed upon the law of supply and demand. "I dare say it's a warning," murmured the baker, brushing flour from his coat. "We must watch each other carefully." By the time the vicar passed through, the story had taken on a life of its own. Some claimed the widow had whispered to her husband, others asserted she had been caught stroking his hand while pouring the tea. Purported details multiplied in exact proportion to the audience's imagination. Purbright, arriving shortly after lunch to commence his inquiries, observed these discussions with quiet detachment. He noted how the facts shifted subtly in tone with each retelling. Flour became sugar, polite attentiveness became obsession, and an otherwise ordinary gesture, pouring tea, assumed the dimensions of an almost ceremonial act. It was the sort of social phenomenon that could never be entirely captured in written reports, yet for an observer of human behaviour, It was telling indeed. He began with Mrs. Hemingway herself, inviting her to his office under the pretense of formal questioning. She arrived punctually with the same careful posture and measured smile that had attended the tea service. "I imagine the town has been speculative," Purbright remarked, gesturing toward the small armchair she took across from him. "Yes," she admitted without a hint of embarrassment. "People find it difficult to accept that grief may be quiet or structured. I only did what felt proper." "And that included offering tea?" T asked, not for clarification, but for cadence, allowing the words to hang lightly in the air. She inclined her head, serene. "One must maintain certain routines, otherwise one loses one's grip on life altogether." Purbright made no further comment, simply noting the delicate inflection of her voice, the evenness of her gestures, and the absence of hesitation. Observations such as these rarely appeared in reports, yet they formed a lattice through which truth often passed, unimpeded. Next he spoke to the local undertaker, Mr. Keble, a man who viewed the ritual of death with the same diligence one might afford to a meticulous ledger. "She insisted on every detail," Keble said, polishing his gloves with slow, deliberate motions. "Placement of chair, angle of head, the teacups. It was as if she intended the scene to be watched." "By the town?" Purbright suggested softly. "Yes, naturally, and perhaps for her own satisfaction," Keble added, with a faint twang of admiration mixed with apprehension. "One does not often encounter such fastidiousness." The inspector left the undertaker's premises with nothing concrete but several impressions: the widow's meticulousness, the town's readiness to embellish, and the subtle confirmation that the act of pouring tea was unusual enough to be remarked upon, yet performed with genuine propriety. Each observation deepened the puzzle rather than narrowing it. In the following days, he extended his inquiries to neighbours, shopkeepers, and the few council members who had attended the flower and vegetable show. Every conversation revealed layers of the town's character. Mr. Tully, the vicar, fretted about spiritual propriety. Mrs. Clements, who ran the tobacconist, was convinced of an emotional imbalance, and the clerk of the council seemed torn between admiration for her devotion and horror at its theatricality. Each offered minor, sometimes contradictory, details that Purbright catalogued silently. A small but curious observation caught his attention. In nearly every account, there was mention of a particular pattern on the teapot, a delicate floral motif that none of the witnesses seemed able to describe accurately, yet all remembered seeing. It seemed trivial, yet something about it niggled at Purbright's methodical mind. Ordinary citizens might overlook such minutiae, but he knew that overlooked minutiae often revealed more than grand gestures. By the week's end, the town's collective imagination had already painted several theories. Some suspected morbid affection, others hinted at underlying madness, while a few daring souls whispered of opportunism. Perhaps the widow sought to secure inheritance with unusual attention to public spectacle. Yet Purbright withheld judgment, as always. He knew the truth rarely resided in the most obvious conjecture. It lived in the quiet corners, in unspoken gestures, in inconsistencies small enough to pass unnoticed by everyone, except the attentive observer. That evening, as he reviewed his mental notes over a cup of tea in his office, he realized that the widow's behavior had created a delicate social fissure. People were polite, yet nervous, curious, yet constrained by convention, and somewhere within this lattice of civility, a small anomaly awaited discovery, something only the patient, the quietly observant, could discern. Purbright sipped his tea thoughtfully, aware that the day's inquiries had merely set the stage for a deeper investigation. The town's gossip, though seemingly chaotic, had begun to outline patterns he would soon be able to follow. Thus, Flaxborough moved through its ordinary routines with a new undercurrent of suspicion and fascination. Even as shop doors closed and the lamplighter's evening rounds commenced, Purbright's mind traced faint connections, minor contradictions, and the delicate minutiae of human behaviour. He knew that sooner or later the truth would emerge, not with dramatic flourish, but quietly, unmistakably, like the steady drip of tea into a waiting cup. The week following the flower and vegetable show unfolded with a peculiar rhythm in Flaxborough. Gossip had settled into the kind of steady hum that is peculiar to small towns, loud enough to be noticed, subtle enough to avoid any real consequence. Yet beneath that hum, Inspector Purbright perceived the careful patterns of human behaviour, patterns that, if traced with patience, often revealed more than the loudest assertions of fact. By mid-week, attention had coalesced around Mr. Leonard Pritchard, the widower's neighbour, and the town's amateur historian. Pritchard had been observed leaning over the hedgerow adjacent to the Hemingway property on the morning following the tea tableau. Neighbours claimed, with the polite exaggeration customary in Flaxborough, that he had watched far too intently, and a few, less cautious, suggested that his historical curiosity might be tinged with more personal motives. Purbright approached Mr. Pritchard with characteristic courtesy, inviting him to his office for a chat about local history, a pretext which suited the elderly man perfectly. Pritchard arrived promptly, clutching a notebook of faded pages, brimming with dates, family trees, and carefully rendered sketches of the town's landmarks. "Inspector," Pritchard said, adjusting his spectacles with a tremor that could have been nerves or age, "I trust you are well." "Quite," Purbright replied, noting the man's nervous glance toward the window. "I wanted to discuss the history of the Hemingway residence. It seems you have a particular interest in it." "Ah, yes," Pritchard said, settling into the chair opposite the inspector. "Curious building, curious people. One must document such things before they vanish entirely." "Of course," Purbright murmured, watching him carefully. "I understand you were near the property on the morning after Mrs. Hemingway's tea service." Pritchard's hand twitched. "Merely observing. No intrusion intended. One cannot help noticing the unusual, Inspector." "Indeed," Purbright said with gentle emphasis, letting the pause linger. "Unusual actions can sometimes conceal ordinary motives, or perhaps ordinary actions conceal something more unusual." The man shifted uncomfortably, then chuckled softly. "You have a way with words, Inspector. I am, alas, a simple chronicler of events, nothing more." Purbright made a note of the slight change in tone, the almost imperceptible tightening of the hand that rested on the notebook. It was trivial, but in Flaxborough, trivialities were the currency of truth. The next inquiry brought him to Mrs. Clements, who ran the tobacconist. She had witnessed Pritchard's morning vigil and was more than eager to recount it. "I must say, Inspector," she began, adjusting her apron and frowning at the counter, "Mr. Pritchard is always a bit overzealous, but on that day, watching the widow with her husband there, it struck me as improper, perhaps even sinister." Purbright nodded. "I see. And did he remain long?" "Long enough to be noticed," she replied. "Long enough that several people commented. And you see, it's odd because he's usually a quiet man." "Yes," Purbright agreed, keeping his tone light. "Odd indeed." He made no overt accusation, merely observing the minutiae of her phrasing and the precise point at which she wrinkled her brow. Every slight contradiction, every carefully modulated indignation was a piece in the puzzle. By Friday, the town had largely agreed that Pritchard's curiosity bordered on impropriety, and the council quietly hinted at the possibility of a formal warning. Purbright, however, had not yet formed any judgment. His mind lingered instead on smaller details that did not appear in gossip. The faint smudge of ink on Mrs. Hemingway's hand, the angle at which the teacup had been placed beside the corpse, and the peculiar absence of a single sugar cube that should have been present, according to routine. That evening, Purbright revisited the Hemingway residence. He moved quietly through the house, noting the small domestic markers of a carefully maintained life. Teacups aligned precisely on their saucers, cushions fluffed to perfection, and the faint aroma of lavender subtly infused the air. So subtle, in fact, that it might have been missed by anyone not attentive. He lingered in the sitting room where Mr. Hemingway had sat during his final days. The armchair, now empty, retained an imprint of its former occupant. The teapot stood on a side table, floral pattern faintly glinting in the last rays of the afternoon sun. Purbright crouched slightly, observing the alignment of the cup handles. One was turned outward, facing the door rather than the deceased, a small inconsistency, trivial to most, yet speaking volumes to the patient observer. As he straightened, he allowed himself a quiet reflection on human nature. People, he thought, are creatures of habit. Yet when habit is interrupted even slightly, it exposes the underlying currents of intention and desire. In Flaxborough, a town devoted to appearances, the smallest deviation was magnified in subtle ways. A tilt of a teacup, a glance held a second too long, a hand tremor at the wrong moment. It was these deviations, he knew, that would guide him toward the truth. Pritchard might have appeared the most conspicuous, yet the most telling details often hid in plain sight, unnoticed by the gossips, misinterpreted by the well-meaning, and entirely invisible to those who had the most to conceal. Purbright returned to his office, recording no formal notes, yet cataloguing everything in his mind. He had observed the town's reactions, heard the gossip, interviewed the witnesses, and noted the first obvious suspect. Yet he withheld judgment. The investigation was far from complete. The trivialities he had recorded would, in time, reveal the true pattern beneath the polite surface, and he felt the quiet certainty that the next incident, minor though it might be, would provide the clue that would anchor the entire inquiry. For now, Flaxborough remained calm, its streets neat, its shops orderly, and its townsfolk still eager to embellish what they scarcely understood. And somewhere in that calm the puzzle waited patiently, as ready to be solved as a teacup balanced just so on a saucer, awaiting the smallest nudge to reveal its hidden story. By the following Monday the town had begun to settle on a tidy narrative. Mr. Leonard Pritchard, observed loitering by the Hemingway hedgerow, and known for his keen interest in local history, had become, in the polite parlance of Flaxborough, the natural suspect. The council met in discreet corners of the town hall, exchanging subdued comments that carried the weight of assumed authority. "One cannot help but notice," murmured the chairman to the clerk, "that Mr. Pritchard seems peculiarly fascinated by the widow's activities." Purbright, however, approached the matter with his usual equanimity. He understood the human need for narrative closure, the tendency to seize upon the most visible irregularity and assign blame. He also knew that truth rarely coincided neatly with collective imagination. His inquiries that morning led him first to the vicar, Mr. Tully, who appeared genuinely concerned about the moral implications of the previous week's events. "It is extraordinary," Tully remarked, adjusting his cassock, "how civility can mask oddities. I do not question her grief, Inspector, but surely there are limits." Purbright inclined his head. "Grief, when combined with habit, can take curious forms. Some are harmless, others less so." "And you have suspicions?" the vicar asked cautiously. "Not yet," Purbright replied, his tone deliberately neutral. "I observe, I listen, and I allow facts to accumulate. One must not rush to judgment." From the vicar, he moved to Mrs. Clements at the tobacconist, who had continued her quiet surveillance of Pritchard's movements. She recounted, with considerable relish, how the man had peered over hedges, noted the widow's gestures, and in general behaved as if he were chronicling a drama. Purbright asked precise, measured questions, listening for subtle inconsistencies. He noted, for instance, how Mrs. Clements described the angle of Pritchard's spectacles, the frequency of his hand movements, the cadence of his voice when speaking of curiosity. Small details, seemingly inconsequential, began to weave a complex picture of observation and intent. Yet it was during a visit to the Hemingway residence itself that Purbright noticed the trivial but odd detail that would, in time, guide the inquiry. The teacup, left as before on its side table, bore a faint but unmistakable trace of lipstick, not Mrs. Hemingway's customary rose shade, but a paler, almost imperceptible hue. He crouched, inspected the porcelain, and observed the subtle discrepancy. The widow's hands were immaculate, and no witnesses had mentioned any visitors during the tea service. The mark, slight though it was, suggested the presence of another party, someone whose identity had escaped the casual observations of the town. This discovery did not yet constitute proof, but it altered the vector of his investigation. Pritchard, who had been the obvious suspect, now seemed less central. The town's gossip, so eager for closure, had overlooked what was silent, small, and carefully concealed. Purbright allowed himself a faint smile. He knew that the truth often lurked in the minutiae ignored by everyone else. He then observed Mrs. Hemingway herself, who moved through the house with the same calm precision as before. She arranged cushions, straightened drapes, and refilled the teapot with a diligence that appeared to confirm her devotion. Yet the faint aroma of lavender persisted, inconsistent with her usual lavender-scented soap. Purbright noted the subtle scent, cataloguing it as one of the quiet irregularities that might, in time, cohere into a full picture. In the late afternoon, he returned to the council chamber to speak with the chairman and the clerk. Their conversation revolved around procedure, civility, and the necessity of appearing decisive. "We must act, Inspector," the chairman said, tapping a manicured finger on the polished oak. "The town's confidence wavers. People are uneasy." "Patience," Purbright replied gently. "Unease is a signal, not a verdict. One must understand the origin before passing judgment." "And the suspect?" the clerk asked, hopeful for a neat solution. Purbright leaned back, smiling faintly. "Mr. Pritchard is observant, yes, but observation alone is rarely a crime. There are subtleties yet unnoticed, details overlooked, and behavior unexamined. We must look carefully before assigning blame." By the day's end, the town's gossip had intensified, now framed around the question of lipstick, the mysterious lavender scent, and the widow's meticulous attention. Some whispered of secret lovers, others of ghostly visitations, and a few ventured the mild suggestion that perhaps the widow herself was capable of peculiar ingenuity. The town was, as always, eager for drama, yet slow to perceive the pattern emerging beneath the surface. Purbright, retiring to his office, considered the week's observations. Each conversation, each contradiction, each seemingly trivial detail added layers to the puzzle. Pritchard remained a figure of interest, but not for the reasons most townsfolk believed. Somewhere between the public spectacle, the minor anomalies, and the quiet gestures of civility, a deeper story waited. And Purbright, patient as ever, knew that the next small incident would bring the latent truth into sharper focus. In the town of Flaxborough, appearances were everything, Yet appearances often concealed the most interesting realities. And for those who observed closely, who listened to the unspoken, and who noted the minutiae of habit and gesture, the narrative was never as simple as the polite chatter of the marketplace suggested. By midweek, Flaxborough had grown restless with speculation. While Leonard Pritchard retained his place as the town's conveniently obvious suspect, other, less conspicuous figures began to emerge from the polite shadows. Subtle rivalries and minor grievances, long submerged beneath layers of civility, now found opportunity to surface. It was the sort of human behaviour Purbright observed with quiet satisfaction. Small irritations, once unnoticed, often held the key to larger truths. His first visit was to Miss Claribel Denham, the widow's niece, who had recently returned from Cambridge. Miss Denham was a model of composure, though her eyes betrayed a mixture of curiosity and mild exasperation at the fuss surrounding her aunt. "I fail to see why the whole town is so scandalized, Inspector," she said briskly, adjusting her gloves. "It was only tea and a man who is, well, deceased. Surely civility dictates we accept such gestures." Purbright inclined his head. "Civility, indeed. But civility can conceal motives, intentional or otherwise. I am simply observing." Miss Denham's expression softened. "In that case, I should tell you that Aunt Gertrude has always been meticulous. Perhaps excessively so, some would say. Everything must be perfect, arranged, accounted for. I dare say the teacup incident was simply another act of propriety." "Perhaps," Purbright murmured. Yet he noted the slight tightness of her smile, the momentary flicker in her eyes, and the way her hands hovered over the tea tray as if instinctively checking its alignment. Such minor gestures, though subtle, often revealed an underlying awareness of events the town could not, or would not, acknowledge. Later he visited Mr. Harold Greaves, the town's solicitor, who had quietly taken notes on the widow's affairs since her husband's passing. "We must be cautious, Inspector," Greaves said, his tone smooth, almost rehearsed. "It is true that Mrs. Hemingway maintains careful habits, yet one must consider all potential angles, family disputes, financial entanglements, even minor inheritances. These things breed tension in otherwise decorous households." Purbright made no immediate response, simply observing the man's inflections and noting the precision of his language. Every word, every pause hinted at the intricate social lattice that surrounded the widow. By Thursday, the second incident occurred. It was small, almost mundane, but in Flaxborough it took on disproportionate significance. The local florist, Mr. Baines, discovered that the widow's prized rosebush planted along the front hedge of her property had been pruned in an irregular pattern. Nothing overtly damaging, yet the deviation from careful symmetry was unmistakable. The town buzzed, some whispered sabotage, others hinted at a message, and a few ventured that perhaps Mrs. Hemingway herself had enacted the change, though why remained obscure. Purbright visited the garden the following morning. He crouched near the soil, noting the pattern of the cuts, the angles, the freshness of the pruning shears marks. It was meticulous work, yet there were subtle anomalies, a slight nick on the corner of one leaf, the faint residue of a chemical treatment not usually employed in her garden. These details, minor and easily overlooked, suggested observation, calculation, and deliberate intervention. The inspector's inquiries expanded. He spoke briefly with the gardener, Mr. Cobb, a reserved man who had worked for the Hemingways for nearly 2 decades. Cobb confirmed he had not pruned the rosebush. "She likes order," he said, straightening his back. "Everything aligned. I wouldn't touch it without instruction." "Was anyone else present?" Purbright asked softly. Cobb shook his head. "Not that I saw, though the town does love to gossip." Purbright left the property with a series of mental notes. The widow's habitual precision, the small anomalies in her garden, the absence of visible intruders. Something about the second incident hinted at subtle manipulation, an almost imperceptible message embedded within ordinary domesticity. By the end of the week, the town had added new characters to its informal roster of suspects. Mrs. Tregarran, the baker's widow, had commented on the irregularity of the rosebush, while simultaneously suggesting that the widow's meticulousness bordered on obsession. The council clerk speculated quietly that the floral pattern might conceal coded intentions. And Leonard Pritchard, still under mild suspicion, was increasingly a peripheral figure. In the evolving narrative, Purbright, however, paid attention not to the gossip, but to the small telling inconsistencies, the faint trace of lipstick in the tea room, the lavender scent incongruous with daily habits, and the precise, unusual pruning of the rosebush. Each of these minor observations taken together formed a lattice of hints that no casual observer would notice. He understood that the forthcoming phase of the inquiry, his private reflections, careful tests, and polite confrontation, would rely entirely on these subtle details. As he returned to his office that Friday evening, the streets of Flaxborough were bathed in the soft glow of lanterns, the evening quiet except for distant gossip muffled through curtained windows. Purbright sipped his tea, reflecting on the town's fascination with appearances. It was a common error, he mused, to confuse spectacle with reality. The most telling truths he knew were always understated, residing in quiet gestures, minor inconsistencies, and the faintest irregularities, details the casual eye could never hope to catch. And in those details lay the key to understanding the widow Hemingway, the seemingly innocuous teacup, and the gentle but deliberate unfolding of events that had, in such an ordinary town, quietly begun to disturb the very fabric of propriety. The weekend arrived with the gentle drizzle typical of Flaxborough, a town where rain was never a disruption, merely a polite accompaniment to the rhythm of daily life. Inspector Purbright spent the morning in quiet reflection, reviewing the chain of observations collected over the past fortnight. He preferred this method, allowing events to settle in the mind like fine sediment, revealing patterns invisible amid the clatter of gossip and conjecture. He considered the widow's meticulous tea service, the faint trace of unexpected lipstick, the subtle aroma of lavender, and the irregular pruning of the rosebush. On their own, each detail seemed trivial. Together, they formed a lattice that suggested careful planning rather than impulsive behavior. He wondered about motivation. Was it grief, eccentricity, or something more deliberate? In Flaxborough, the distinction was rarely obvious until the final act of observation revealed it. His first reflection concerned human nature itself. People, he thought, instinctively concealed their desires beneath layers of propriety. Politeness was both armor and camouflage. Townsfolk, eager to maintain appearances, often overlooked inconsistencies too subtle to provoke scandal. Yet these inconsistencies spoke more truth than loud declarations ever could. The widow, he decided, was a master of this quiet language, using ordinary gestures to conceal intent. Next, he revisited the town's social network in his mind. Leonard Pritchard remained a figure of minor suspicion, but increasingly peripheral. Miss Claribel Denham, though outwardly composed, carried hints of unease in small gestures, the flicker of an eye, the twitch of a hand. Mr. Greaves, the solicitor, spoke with smooth authority, yet his careful phrasing suggested knowledge he preferred to veil. Even the council chairman, ostensibly concerned with civility and procedural correctness, displayed subtle signs of anxiety over the town's perception. It was during this period of private reflection that Purbright devised a discreet test. He understood that in Flaxborough, subtlety often proved more effective than confrontation. A well-placed remark, An innocuous question or a casually arranged meeting could unsettle the guilty far more efficiently than overt interrogation. He intended to observe reactions, not force admissions. On Monday morning, he arranged to visit the Hemingway residence under the pretext of routine follow-up inquiries regarding household arrangements. The widow greeted him with her customary serenity, placing a fresh cup of tea before him. "Inspector," she said, with a faint, measured smile, "I trust your investigations proceed smoothly." "As smoothly as any in Flaxborough," he replied, sipping the tea carefully. "Though I am always interested in the finer points of domestic practice. One can learn much from habit, even in grief." Her smile did not falter, yet her eyes betrayed a subtle alertness. She was attentive, calculating, aware that observation alone could be revealing. Purbright noted this quietly. It was precisely the response he had anticipated. He allowed the conversation to drift toward trivialities, the angle of chair cushions, the arrangement of scones, the precise pattern of the tea table. All the while, he observed her gestures, tone, and minor inconsistencies. The widow's movements were deliberate, measured, almost rehearsed. Yet in the small twitch of a wrist, the fraction of hesitation in her voice, he detected the faintest signal of awareness, the shadow of something unspoken. Later that afternoon, he revisited Miss Denham, ostensibly to discuss local historical records. Their conversation was polite, yet Purbright subtly emphasized certain details: the sequence of tea service, the irregular pruning of the rose bush, and the small anomalies he had noticed. Miss Denham responded with impeccable composure, but the careful emphasis of her phrasing suggested she was absorbing, calculating, and perhaps even protecting someone. By the week's end, Purbright had formed a quiet understanding. The first obvious suspect had been an easy target for gossip. The true complexities lay elsewhere, embedded in subtle details and concealed intentions. He knew that to resolve the mystery, he would require not force, but patience, politeness, and a well-placed test to provoke a revealing response. Flaxborough, meanwhile, continued its gentle, orderly existence, unaware that beneath the veneer of civility, observation was silently drawing threads together. The widow Hemingway maintained her careful routine. The townsfolk whispered behind lace curtains and over scones, and Purbright, with a measured sip of tea in his office, contemplated the quiet intricacies of human behavior that would soon reveal the truth entirely on their own terms. By the following week, Flaxborough had resumed its ordinary rhythms, yet an undercurrent of curiosity and unease persisted. People spoke in hushed tones, glanced furtively toward the Hemingway residence, and speculated endlessly about what constituted grief and what bordered on the peculiar. Purbright, ever observant, noted the patterns of conversation, the selective omission of detail, the embellishment of trivial facts, and the polite exaggeration of impropriety. It was a familiar lattice, one he could trace with patience. That Monday morning, he returned to the Hemingway residence with a quiet purpose. He had devised a subtle test, one that would allow him to observe reactions without forcing confession. It involved the careful orchestration of minor irregularities in routine, delivered as seemingly casual remarks and inquiries. "Mrs. Hemingway," he began as she poured tea with her customary precision, "I have been reflecting on the rose bush. A curious pruning, was it not? Slightly irregular." Her hands paused mid-motion, and a fleeting flicker crossed her face, almost imperceptible, but enough for Purbright to note. I had not noticed," she said softly, a faint flush rising to her cheeks. "The gardener tends it regularly. Perhaps a branch required trimming." "Perhaps," Purbright replied, allowing the pause to stretch, sipping his tea with deliberate calm. Though one observes that even minor deviations from habit can carry significance. She straightened imperceptibly, rearranging the teacup, so that its handle now faced toward him, as if correcting some subtle imbalance. Purbright catalogued the movement in silence. It was precisely the reaction he had anticipated. The widow, confronted indirectly with a minor anomaly, had revealed an awareness of deviation. Not guilt, necessarily, but attentiveness to irregularity. Later, he met Miss Claribel Denham at the town library, ostensibly to discuss historical records. Purbright, with gentle politeness, emphasized details previously noted: the alignment of teacups, the faint lipstick mark, the lavender scent, the pruned rosebush. Miss Denham's composure remained, but there were subtle cues in her expressions and phrasing, slight hesitation, a careful choice of words that suggested she was both absorbing and shielding information. By midweek, Purbright had expanded his observations to other townsfolk. Mr. Greaves, the solicitor, exhibited a precision in language that suggested concealment, while the council chairman's casual remarks betrayed a faint anxiety about propriety and public perception. Even the vicar, Mr. Tully, displayed hints of concern beyond the moral, as if he suspected currents in the household that exceeded ordinary grief. The subtle test reached its peak one afternoon when Purbright returned to the Hemingway residence under the pretext of verifying household arrangements for the upcoming memorial service. He intentionally left the teacup handle misaligned, adjusted the angle of the chair slightly, and mentioned the absence of a sugar cube in casual, almost incidental tone. Mrs. Hemingway's reaction was instantaneous, though graceful. A slight tilt of the head, a quick glance toward the teacup, and the faintest purse of the lips. Purbright observed silently, noting the coordination of minor gestures. Hands moved to correct alignment, a delicate breath, a slight change in posture. She was aware that observation was in play, and her reaction confirmed attentiveness to anomalies that others might overlook. Purbright allowed the situation to settle without further comment, understanding that the next stage, when all details coalesced, would require no force, only quiet exposition. He returned to his office in the early evening, cataloguing the interactions, gestures, and subtle corrections. Every minute detail, every irregularity, and every reaction was another thread to be woven into the final tapestry of understanding. Flaxborough continued its ordered existence. Shop windows gleamed, the baker's oven glowed warmly, and townsfolk discussed trivialities with polite fervour. Yet beneath the veneer of normality, Purbright traced a lattice of minor deviations, concealed intentions and deliberate gestures. The town believed the case was confined to gossip and speculation, but he knew that in the quiet attention to detail, the truth was already taking shape. By the week's end, the lattice of observation was complete. The trivial anomalies, the minor deviations from habit, and the subtle reactions had provided Purbright with the framework to understand not just what had occurred, but why. The next phase, he knew, would be to reveal the truth calmly, linking each minor observation into a coherent explanation, allowing the town to see events as they truly had unfolded. The town of Flaxborough, at first glance, continued its gentle, ordered existence, but Purbright knew that beneath the surface, subtle currents had begun to converge. Each minor observation, every trivial anomaly, and each understated gesture had accumulated into a lattice that hinted at a coherent pattern, visible only to one who observed patiently. That Monday morning, he revisited the Hemingway residence under the guise of routine follow-up. The widow greeted him with her usual composed demeanour, though he noted a faint awareness in her eyes, as if she sensed that his visits had purpose beyond mere formality. The teacups were perfectly aligned, cushions precisely placed, and the faint aroma of lavender still lingered, now more noticeable because it contrasted subtly with the customary scent of fresh tea. Purbright allowed small, seemingly insignificant details to guide the conversation. The rosebush, he began casually. "Seems to have recovered well from the recent pruning. A curious pattern, would you not agree?" Mrs. Hemingway's hands paused mid-motion. "I suppose it is somewhat irregular," she said carefully. "But it is thriving, is it not?" "Yes, indeed," Purbright replied, letting the observation linger. "It is remarkable how even slight deviations from habit can draw attention. One might almost say they reveal more than intended." Her gaze faltered for an imperceptible instant, enough for Purbright to catalogue it without remark. Every small twitch, every minor hesitation was a piece of the intricate mosaic that would soon form the full picture. He then met with Miss Claribel Denham at the town library, ostensibly to review historical records. Their conversation, polite and measured, revolved around the ordinary details of the Hemingway household. Purbright subtly emphasized inconsistencies: the faint lipstick on the teacup, the lavender scent, the irregular pruning, and the minor variations in the alignment of household items. Miss Denham responded with impeccable composure, yet he noted slight hesitations and careful word choices that suggested awareness, if not direct culpability. Over the next few days he revisited the solicitor, Mr. Greaves, and the council chairman. Both men, when approached casually, revealed nothing overtly incriminating, but their careful phrasing, the slight tension in their gestures, and the discreet avoidance of certain topics contributed further threads to the emerging pattern. It was in the quiet moments, walking along the cobbled streets, observing the polite interactions of shopkeepers, noting the subtle inflections in conversations, that Purbright began to connect the dots. The widow's apparent meticulousness, once considered eccentric but harmless, now took on a dimension of deliberate calculation. Minor deviations, the teacup handle turned outward, the faint lipstick, the pruned rosebush, formed a chain of subtle signals, each linking to an unseen participant, and each hinting at an underlying intention. By Friday, he had conducted a private review of all observations. The first obvious suspect, Leonard Pritchard, had been largely exonerated by the absence of concrete involvement, though his penchant for observation had made him a convenient scapegoat for the town's gossip. The more important evidence lay in the quiet attention of Mrs. Hemingway and the subtle, protective gestures of Miss Denham. Purbright's reflection turned to motive. The widow's behaviour suggested a desire for order and control, an insistence that domestic ritual not be disrupted even in the presence of death. Yet the anomalies hinted at external interference, or at least the perception of it. Someone else had interacted with the scene, left a minor but telling mark, and the widow, fully aware, had responded with a blend of propriety and discreet correction. That evening, as the town settled into its accustomed calm, Purbright reviewed the sequence of events once more. The tea service, the first anomalies noted by neighbours, the lipstick, the lavender, the rosebush, and the reactions of key figures. Each element had been catalogued, observed, and tested through subtle inquiry. The lattice was complete, the pattern discernible, and the solution, he realized, would not require dramatics but a calm, civil explanation, delivered with the same understated precision that had guided his entire investigation. Flaxborough, meanwhile, remained unaware. The baker closed his shop, the tobacconist adjusted the window display, and the council clerk prepared the week's minutes, entirely oblivious to the careful observation taking place in parallel. The lattice of human behaviour had formed its pattern in quiet reflection, and the truth waited, poised for the moment when it could be revealed without spectacle or melodrama. Purbright sipped his tea, noting with quiet satisfaction that the stage was now set. All that remained was a final polite test, a conversation designed to elicit confirmation, and the calm explanation that would allow every subtle observation to fall into its proper place. The town's appearance of normality was intact, but the lattice beneath had already begun to speak. The following week dawned over Flaxborough with its usual air of gentle civility. Streets glistened from overnight rain, and shopkeepers polished counters as if to reinforce the town's orderly facade. Yet for Inspector Purbright, the days were charged with the quiet anticipation of resolution. The lattice of observations carefully constructed over the preceding fortnight now demanded a polite but deliberate test. He returned once more to the Hemingway residence, entering under the guise of checking arrangements for the upcoming local council memorial service. Mrs. Hemingway greeted him with her habitual serenity, her hands folded neatly, her posture impeccable. She had not altered a single detail in the sitting room, yet Purbright noted a subtle alertness in her expression, a readiness for scrutiny that only the observant would detect. "Mrs. Hemingway," he began, his tone calm and unhurried, "I've been reflecting upon minor inconsistencies that have arisen, small perhaps, but curious nonetheless." She inclined her head, eyes meeting his. "Curious, Inspector? I assure you, I have maintained routine as best I can." "Of course," Purbright replied, letting his gaze linger momentarily on the teacup handle, which was now slightly askew. "Yet one cannot help noticing the faint trace of lipstick, the subtle scent of lavender, and the pruning of the rosebush outside. Each detail in isolation may appear trivial, but together they suggest careful attention, or perhaps interaction by another party." A slight flicker crossed her face, just enough for Purbright to note. Her hands shifted subtly, a minor adjustment of a cushion, a gentle straightening of a teacup. He said nothing further, letting the weight of observation settle. The widow, aware of his focus on details she could neither ignore nor fully explain, revealed through gesture and posture a recognition that she was being watched with precision. Purbright allowed the moment to linger, sipping his own tea, cataloguing every minor adjustment, every micro-expression. He had observed her attentiveness, her meticulous habits, and the faint indications that she had anticipated interference. Yet the crucial point remained: the subtle discrepancies had been introduced not by her alone. Someone else had interacted with the scene, leaving minute, telling traces. Later that afternoon, he visited Miss Claribel Denham under the pretext of discussing town records. In casual conversation, he emphasized the sequence of minor anomalies: the pruned rosebush, the misaligned teacup, and the faintly perceptible lipstick. Miss Denham responded with impeccable composure, yet the slightest hesitation, the careful phrasing of her words, suggested she was aware of details she had not fully disclosed. Purbright listened and watched in silence, his polite question serving as a test. Would she reveal, or would her own attention to propriety maintain the carefully constructed facade? By Friday, all minor inconsistencies had been observed and tested. Leonard Pritchard, the town's original focal point of suspicion, had proven peripheral, a convenient figure for gossip rather than evidence. The solicitor, the council chairman, and even the vicar contributed no decisive clues beyond their careful phrasing and subtle gestures. The lattice of observation now centred entirely on the widow and her close companion, the niece. Purbright reflected on the nature of human behaviour, particularly in Flaxborough. Civility, routine, and decorum were as much shields as they were habits. The smallest deviations, tiny gestures, minute adjustments, subtle scents, often revealed more than statements, confessions, or accusations ever could. In this case, he realized, the truth resided in attentiveness, the anticipation of observation, and the careful management of appearances. He concluded the week with a quiet plan. The next meeting, executed with calm civility, would allow him to explain the chain of minor irregularities and the subtle interactions between widow and niece. The minor details, the teacup, the rosebush, the lavender, the lipstick, would coalesce into a coherent narrative. In Flaxborough, the revelation would be civil, understated, and entirely free from melodrama. The stage was set. Every small observation had its place, every gesture had been catalogued, and the town, blissfully unaware, would soon perceive that the trivial had concealed intention and that civility had masked subtle, deliberate action. Purbright's polite test had been successful. The lattice of human behaviour had revealed itself, ready for calm exposition. The geekster. Following Monday, the town of Flaxborough carried on with its usual understated rhythm. The baker's oven exhaled warmth, shop windows gleamed with polished clarity, and the council clerk meticulously arranged the week's paperwork. All seemed ordinary, yet Purbright knew that beneath this veneer the lattice of observation had reached its moment of revelation. He approached the Hemingway residence with quiet anticipation, fully aware that the final act of exposition required patience, civility, and precise attention to detail. Mrs. Hemingway greeted him as before, composed and serene, though a subtle alertness now tinged her gestures. The teacup perfectly aligned, the cushions precisely arranged, and the faint scent of lavender, all were indicators of her continued attentiveness. Purbright observed in silence for a few moments, allowing her habitual order to speak volumes before he began. "Mrs. Hemingway," he said softly, "I have been reflecting upon the recent minor irregularities that have captured the town's attention. The teacup, the faint trace of lipstick, the pruned rosebush, the subtle scent of lavender. They each seemed trivial on their own, yet together they reveal a pattern." Her hands adjusted a cushion slightly, a minute, almost imperceptible gesture that betrayed awareness. "A pattern, Inspector?" she asked, her voice calm but precise, betraying neither fear nor guilt, merely curiosity. "Yes," Purbright replied, his tone measured. "A pattern of careful observation, anticipation, and management of appearances. The widow, attentive to propriety, maintained routine, but someone else, deliberate in minor interventions, introduced small anomalies to test attention or provoke awareness. The lipstick, the slight lavender scent, the irregular pruning, all indicators of interaction beyond mere accident." He paused, allowing the quiet of the sitting room to absorb his words. Miss Claribel Denham, present and attentive, responded subtly, protecting those details with impeccable composure. Leonard Pritchard, though long considered a suspect, acted merely as an observer, fascinated by the patterns around him. The solicitor, the council chairman, and the vicar each contributed only minor threads, careful phrasing and subtle gestures. The lattice of events centered, in truth, on attentiveness, not misdeed. Mrs. Hemingway inclined her head slightly, a serene acknowledgement of understanding. "And so," she said softly, "the town's gossip has exaggerated what is, in reality, simple attention to detail?" "Exactly," Purbright replied, smiling faintly. The trivial became a narrative, and the ordinary became curious only because it was observed. Civility, habit, and meticulous care were mistaken for intrigue. The lipstick, the lavender, the rosebush, all were minor signs noted and interpreted, but without nefarious intent. The town saw drama where only decorum prevailed. He rose gently, placing a hand briefly on the back of a chair. "It is a lesson, perhaps, in observation. Appearances may conceal nothing, yet they may also conceal the entirely mundane. The lattice of human behaviour is subtle, often polite, but always revealing to the patient observer." Mrs. Hemingway smiled faintly, a quiet acknowledgement that Flaxborough's ordinary civility had for a moment been illuminated. Purbright, with the satisfaction of meticulous resolution, departed the residence, allowing the calm of routine to reassert itself. By the end of the day, the town had resumed its orderly patterns, the gossip gently ebbing as minor details were understood and recontextualized. The widow continued her routines, Miss Denham maintained her composure, and Leonard Pritchard resumed his quiet walks free from suspicion. The lattice of minor anomalies had been observed, catalogued and explained, leaving only the polite calm that so defined Flaxborough. Purbright returned to his office, the quiet click of his teacup punctuating the serenity of his thoughts. The resolution had required neither drama nor confrontation, only patience, observation, and the subtle art of civil inquiry. He filed his notes, aware that the town would resume its appearance of ordinary order, blissfully unaware of the careful attention that had ensured that the truth, mundane though it was, had emerged in full. The following week in Flaxborough dawned with its familiar, gentle rhythm. The baker's morning loaf, the polished shop windows, and the soft murmur of council clerks created an impression of uninterrupted civility. Yet beneath this ordinary surface, a quiet satisfaction permeated the observant mind of Inspector Purbright. The case, resolved through subtle attention and patient deduction, now required only the calm observation of aftermath. Mrs. Hemingway continued her precise routines. The teacups were aligned, the cushions arranged with meticulous care, and the faint aroma of lavender lingered unobtrusively, now understood not as intrigue, but as habit and attentiveness. She moved through the house with calm assurance, her gestures measured, her expression serene. The small anomalies, lipstick, lavender scent, the pruned rosebush, no longer carried the weight of suspense, merely markers of careful observation by those involved. Miss Claribel Denham, the niece, maintained her composed vigilance. Her careful phrasing, measured gestures, and attentiveness had been part of the lattice of subtle signs that Purbright had traced to their conclusion. Now those behaviours were quietly normalized, woven seamlessly into the fabric of ordinary life. Leonard Pritchard, once the focus of gossip, resumed his walks along the Hemingway hedgerow, observing patterns with a benign curiosity, free from suspicion. The town, for its part, gradually absorbed the resolution. Gossip softened, speculation quieted, and civility reasserted itself. Shopkeepers and council members alike returned to routines, exchanging polite remarks over scones and tea, the previous minor curiosities fading into memory. Where once small deviations had sparked intrigue, now the lattice of human behaviour settled back into the comforting rhythm of ordinary observation. Purbright himself returned to the quietude of his office. He reviewed the notes compiled over the past weeks. The teacup, with its faint trace of lipstick, the subtle scent of lavender, the irregular pruning of the rosebush, and the minor, deliberate gestures of attentiveness by both widow and niece. Each observation had formed part of a cohesive narrative, revealing the truth, not through dramatic confrontation, but through careful, patient, and polite inquiry. He reflected on the nature of Flaxborough itself, a town where appearances governed perception, where civility masked the undercurrents of human behaviour, and where small, seemingly trivial details often carried more weight than overt action. The case had required no spectacle, no drama, only observation, understanding, and subtle, quiet testing. By the close of the week, the town had resumed its ordinary patterns. Shop windows gleamed, the baker's oven exhaled its warmth, and the council clerk filed documents with meticulous precision. The widow Hemingway continued her tea service with grace, the niece maintained her composed presence, and Leonard Pritchard wandered the streets with benign curiosity. All was calm, orderly and proper, just as Flaxborough had always been, yet subtly enriched by the gentle revelation of the truth. Inspector Purbright, satisfied that the lattice of human behaviour had been fully observed and understood, returned to his paperwork. Each minor anomaly had been accounted for, every gesture catalogued, and the quiet civility of the town preserved. As he sipped his tea, he allowed himself a faint, private smile. The extraordinary, after all, had always resided in the ordinary, waiting for a patient eye to discern it. Flaxborough, restored to its familiar rhythms, remained blissfully unaware of the subtle art that had preserved both truth and propriety. The case concluded, the lattice of minor details fully illuminated, and the town, in its gentle civility, resumed its timeless, understated order.